process payroll in order to make sure we have enough time to get that implemented. There's also been times where we just simply had to process payroll before this was implemented, where we just simply had to process payroll so our employees would be paid, with not always having the best information that we would like to have had.
Now, in your experience, who would have been responsible for providing you the information that you would want to avail?
The chief.
Now, the auditor went on to state that he found a failure to properly manage time reports and overtime that resulted in an overpayment of $517.73 to one employee for December 25th to 29th, 2011. Are you familiar with that finding of the auditor?
I am.
Okay. And did you gather the information from the auditor that was the basis for that finding?
I compiled the timesheets that showed that discrepancy.
Okay. If you would turn to tab 7. Tell when you get a chance to go to tab 7, tell the city council is that do I have the right copy there?
Yes.
Okay. Tell the city council what tab 7 is.
Tab 7 is a summary of the discrepancies that were noted between the 13 months worth of back overtime that was filed on behalf of this one employee, and the bi-weekly payroll reports that were also filed during the same time period that extended during the time period that the police chief was responsible for building and zoning work as a result of an executive order.
Now, if you would, let's just go to the sheet that's at the front of tab 7. What is that sheet?
This is that summary that I put together that noted the discrepancies between those two sets of payroll.
Did you prepare that summary?
I did.
Okay. And where is this documentation that supports that summary attached as a part of tab 7?
It is.
And is the documentation that's attached in support of that summary, were those records part of the city's records?
They are today, yes.
Okay. Where the state auditor found the $517.73 discrepancy, was that an overpayment or an underpayment to the building inspector?
Yeah, it was an overpayment for 9 hours that was submitted twice on 2 different timesheets.
And and submitted twice on 2 different timesheets?
It was submitted once as a part of the 13-month back overtime, and then it was also submitted 2 weeks later on that same employee's bi-weekly payroll.
And again, when you say that same employee, this is the detective/building inspector, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now is that $517 figure noted on your summary?
It is as a part of that total.
Okay, and tell the city council where they can find that particular $517.
That $517 would be the 9 hours that is shown under December 31, 2011, and then you would take that number and times it by the overtime rate of the employee of $57.53.
And that would equal how much?
That would equal the $517.
Now, did your analysis in this summary sheet on tab 7 go beyond that $517?
It did.
Okay, and if you would explain, you explained the hours that you found. What was the total amount that was at issue based upon your analysis?
A total of 21 hours, and with an additional 6 hours that were paid at an overtime rate for work that was not done while an employee was in overtime state, because it was for hours worked while an employee was out sick. And that total, including wages, retirement, and FICA, would equal total about $2,300.
Okay, and you'll see there at the bottom of your summary sheet, you have $2,321.98, correct?
Correct.
Now, does that constitute an underpayment or an overpayment to this detective/building inspector?
This is an overpayment.
And who would have been responsible for reviewing the timesheets which resulted in this overpayment of $2,300?
All of these payments were approved by the chief.
Now, the third finding of the auditor was a finding that work hours reported by it says the employee, that would be the building inspector, detective lacked sufficient detailed documentation and appeared excessive at times. Are you familiar with that finding of the auditor?
I am.
Okay. And did you gather the documentation? I've asked you this a little bit before, but just to be clear, did you gather the documentation about the work hours reported by the building inspector for the state auditor? You understand the question?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Did you notice yourself in that review a lack of detailed documentation?
I did.
Okay, can you describe for the city council what lack of detailed documentation you identified on your review of those documents?
The documents simply contain a list of hours worked and a list of various job duties that were performed during this time period, but there was no other documentation within the city records to back up those work activities, such as permits that may have been issued were not also found in the city records. Inspection reports were not provided. Emails that were said to have been sent were not provided.
It goes on and states that the auditor further states concerns related to the number of hours worked by an employee who had a wide range of job duties within the city associated with police, building, zoning, and code enforcement, as well as floodplain administration services. Are you familiar with that finding of the state auditor?
I am.
And are you aware of this person that we've been referring to as the detective and building inspector having a wide range of duties as described in that finding of the auditor?
I am.
And the auditor goes on to state that in several instances, this employee would record the total number of daily hours worked. However, the employee did not record the actual time of day the employee performed the work. Are you familiar with that finding of the auditor?
I am.
And based upon your review of the records that you prepared for the auditor, is that an accurate statement?
It is, particularly in the first part of 2011, before signed timesheets were required.
The auditor goes on to state, quote, while the city timesheets appear to require actual time of day work was performed to be documented, the city did not always require this information to process the employee's payroll. Are you familiar with that finding?
I am.
And based upon your experience, is that an accurate statement?
It is.
Now, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about this timesheet that the auditor indicates requires the day the work was performed as part of the information provided. With regard to the building inspector detective, was that part of the report, were there instances where that part of the report was not filled in?
Yes.
Okay. And just describe, if you would, for the city council, some examples of that failure.
Well, there would be, again, times, particularly in the first part of 2011, where the only information we had to go by was the access reports that were provided by the chief.
And did the access reports not identify the time at the hour that this person worked?
They did not. They simply know the total number of hours worked.
Did it show the day that the person worked?
Yes.
So you might know that somebody worked for 8 hours, but you wouldn't know if that was from midnight to 8 a.m. or 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., is that right?
That's correct. Not on the access payroll reports that were provided.
Now, did you look for the individual signed timesheets as a part of preparing the documentation for the auditor?
I did.
And did you find any of those?
I did, from the end of March forward.
So prior to March, were some of these documents missing?
There were just no signed timesheets before the end of March.
Okay, so you had timesheets, just not signed.
Well, we just had the access reports.
Okay. And that's a computer report, correct?
Correct.
Now, again, who was responsible for this particular employee related to these findings that we just went through by the auditor?
That employee supervisor was the chief.
Now, the auditor goes on to state that, quote, "Without this detail, a reviewer would be unable to sufficiently evaluate the work hours claimed by the employee and monitor the number of hours reported for reasonableness and possible duplication." Are you familiar with that finding of the auditor?
I am.
And just from your own experience, if you had, not saying you're the auditor, but if you had reviewed those reports as the auditor did, in your experience, would you have been able to evaluate the work hours claimed by the employee and monitor the number of hours reported for reasonableness?
As I compiled the records, I found it very difficult to explain the number of hours that were being submitted, particularly once both timesheets had been submitted.
Now, did you review other payroll records during this time period?
I did.
Okay, were there other, when you reviewed those other records, were there other police officers that also had failed to, sign timesheets or fill them out in the manner that you described?
On occasion, yes.
Again, with regard to tab 7, based upon your review of the documentation attached, do you believe that the statement of overpayment of $2,329.98 is an accurate calculation?
That is an accurate calculation of the total cost to the city.
If you would, please turn to tab 4. Tell the, are you there?
I am.
Is that Executive Order 2010-01?
Yeah, it is.
And I'm sorry, you at tab 4.
Yes, sir.
Now, is this executive order, it looks like it's signed by Mayor Mike Sadowskis on page 2?
Yes.
And just for the record, that's VHPD document 421 and 422. And is this part of the records of the city of Villa Hills?
It is.
How does the city maintain a record of executive orders?
There's a binder in the clerk's office by year that has all of the ordinances, municipal orders, and executive orders issued during that year. And executive orders are considered permanent records under records retention schedules. So we have these on file.
And is this an accurate copy of that permanent record?
To my knowledge, yes.
And are you familiar with the original?
I am.
Now, I'll just read this, and it says, "An executive order of the Mayor of Villa Hills in Kenton County, Kentucky, assigning the duties of Schutzman Inspection Services, LLCs, to the Villa Hills Police Department under the direction of Chief Dan Goodenough until such time as there is no certified building and zoning inspector employed in the city of Villa Hills, specifically within the Villa Hills Police Department." That's just a title summary, correct?
Correct.
It's not the entire executive order, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge as the city clerk for Villa Hills, was this executive order in effect up until the time that Schutzman Inspection Services was no longer, or strike that, up until the time that the building inspector detective was no longer employed by the city?
I believe that this executive order was in effect from December of 2010 until those services were shifted back to Schutzman Inspection Services approximately June of 2012.
So up until June of 2012, would this order have been in effect?
Yes.
Now, we talked about the time period when there was the $86,000 in overtime submitted. Was this executive order in effect during that time period?
It was.
Now, we also talked earlier, and that was that overtime request was at tab 6. We've also talked about tab 5. I guess we haven't talked about tab 5 yet. Let's turn to tab 5. is tab 5?
Tab 5 is a summary of the building and zoning documents that are missing from the city's records based on the record retention schedule that the city is required to follow by state statute.
Okay, now it looks like the first 4 pages are word processing document, or maybe up to the first 5 pages. Well, why don't you, let me ask you a better question. Did you prepare a summary of documents that you contend were missing?
Yes.
Okay, and what portion of this did you prepare, and what portion of this were documents that were already of record with the city?
Pages 424, 425, and 426 was prepared by me, and starting on page 429 through 502 were found in the records of the city.
When you say found in the records of the city, tell me where you found these records.
The permits were found in the minutes. I went through and pulled the annual report of permits that was submitted during each council meeting. And the January meeting of every year just happens to have the list of all of the prior year's permits. And so we went back to when this particular employee began doing building and zoning for the city, and identified all of the permits that were issued under this employee's watch. And then we took this list and we went into the records room at the city administration building, where there is a filing cabinet that has a folder for every individual parcel in the city, and looked basically to see if these permits were located within those folders.
And what did you discover?
We discovered that the documents on the first 3 pages were missing.
Just to be clear, did you review city records to make that determination?
I did.
And in your view, based upon your analysis of the city records, is your summary as described in the first few pages of tab 5 accurate?
It is.
Do you have an estimate of how many documents, or do you have an estimate based upon your review of how many documents are missing with regard to building inspections and other issues that you just described in tab 5?
I mean, I really can't put a high-end number on the total number of documents that are missing, because also included within the missing documents are all the inspection reports that should have been retained for the previous 3 years, and all emails that should have been saved for the last 2 years. So I have no idea how much those numbers are. But as far as the permits and the certificates of occupancy and those kind of items, we're pushing somewhere around 75 to 85 documents.
And are those documents that, in your experience, a city's building inspector would have accumulated?
Yes.
Now, was there a circumstance where there were documents that were not present along with other city records related to the building inspector?
I'm sorry, could you say that?
Did the building inspector, did you discover at some point that there were documents that the building inspector may have retained himself?
Yes, became aware that the building inspector probably retained records when we received a note at City Hall on May 28th that the building inspector had placed city records out to the curb the previous Friday.
Okay. And did you know what these records were?
I have no idea what those records were.
Okay. Did you, and just kind of skipping to the end, ultimately did you receive those records back from the building inspector?
There was a court order that was issued that required the building inspector to provide those records, and we received two small boxes full of building plans and some manuals that we had already either had the backup documentation for or no longer needed, like an outdated zoning code.
Now, in your experience, were those documents that you received back in this court order, were those documents that would normally have been retained by a building inspector for a city?
Yes.
If you would turn to tab 8. You see there a letter from Friend Friesen Arnold addressed to you and the mayor.
I guess it
Can you tell the city council what that letter is at tab 8?
It's an invoice from the law firm Friend Friesen Arnold for legal services provided in regards to trying to get those city records back.
And how much did the city have to pay to obtain or to compel the return of
I
those
would
records?
object to the extent, I don't believe any of this relates to Chief Goodenough. I believe it relates to Detective Schutzman. But if you want to try Schutzman's case here, I guess we can do that too.
Well,
Maybe we could bring in Detective Schutzman and try that case.
yes, I'm just asking the clerk to do this. I will make it relevant here very quickly, just the next question, in that the chief was responsible for supervising the activities of Detective Schutzman, and that was his retention of these public records.
I'm going to allow the question, go ahead.
And it looks like the two invoices total in the neighborhood of about $7,000.
So just to be clear with your testimony, is it your testimony that the city had to pay $7,000 in legal fees to recover documents that should have been maintained as city documents by the building inspector?
Yes.
What was the condition? Did you, as a part of preparing the report, I think at tab 5, as a part of preparing that report in tab 5, did you try to gather any other documents from around the city?
I did.
Go ahead, tell the city council what you tried to do there.
Well, there were several instances where just in the normal course of my duties, when I was going about the city, I would find records in odd locations. And at one point, I found 2 garbage bags full of building and zoning plans in the garage of the police department while I was escorting a vendor who was here to provide a security system through the police department building. And so then I took those records and secured them back into the records room with the other building and zoning records where they belong.
Thank you. Now, you testified before, I recall, it's been a little bit while approaching the end of this, that on March 20th, 2013, that you testified about a city council meeting being disrupted. Do you recall that?
I recall that meeting. I was here in the audience.
Okay. And I go ahead and tell the city council what you recall observing at that time.
Sure. That was actually the meeting where the municipal order to appoint the clerk was going to be brought up. I was not yet employed by the city, so I was just attending, waiting to see the municipal order get passed. And in the process of that meeting, there were some residents who came to discuss an issue that the mayor had brought up regarding taking a look at outsourcing, and they wished to speak. The mayor did not give them a forum, and at that point, the meeting really erupted into chaos and degraded pretty fast.
Okay. To your knowledge, had anyone, was Chief Goodenough present that evening?
Yes, he was.
And did he respond in any way to the scene that you just described?
He did not.
And do you know why that was?
I do not.
Was he present during part of that period?
He was present later in the meeting when he provided his police department report, which was after that incident had occurred.
Okay. And were there any further disruptions after his police department report?
There was.
tell the city council, I think they were here, but what you recall happening.
Sure. There was a lady who was sitting next to me who kept performing outbursts as the mayor was conducting the meeting. The mayor warned her to stop. She did not, and the mayor went and got the chief and requested that the chief remove the individual.
And did the chief do as the mayor directed?
He did not.
What did the chief do instead?
Just tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Be quiet."
I admonish the audience, there will be no disruptions or discussion.
Now, were you also present on about May 23rd, 2013, at a disciplinary action involving the mayor and the person I'm referring to here is the detective and building inspector?
I was.
Okay. Can you tell the city council what occurred at that meeting?
That meeting, the purpose of that meeting was to provide a suspension to an employee prior to that employee being given the suspension. His supervisor, the police chief, was brought over to the conference room at the administration building with the mayor and was asked, it was instructed that once this employee arrives, to remove this employee's firearm.
And did the chief do as he was directed by the mayor?
He did not.
Now, are you familiar with the circumstance on or about October 9th of 2013? Well, maybe I did give you the date on the last one, it was May 2013. And the meeting where you described the disruption, do you recall the month and year for that?
The disruption occurred in March, so it would have been the March 20th meeting, 2013.
Now, around October 9th, 2013, did you become aware of the mayor directing the chief with regard to some scheduling matters?
I'm aware that the mayor has routinely asked the chief to minimize overtime and to also not to schedule the two most senior officers in the department on the same floor.
And based upon your work as the city clerk, at that time, around October 9th of 2013, did the chief follow that directive?
Around October 9th, I received a document, a letter to place in the chief's file, personnel file, that was a record that stated he had not been following that directive.
At this point, I'd like to move for admission of each of the exhibits which we've identified as being official records of the city. And those are tab 1, attachments, tab A, B, and C, tab 2, which is the Villa Hills Police Department Rules and Regulations, tab 3, which is the Villa Hills Personnel Policies promulgated by Executive Order 2013-12 and 2013-14, tab 4, which is Executive Order 2010-01, delegating authority over the building inspector to the chief of police. Tab 5, which is a summary with supporting documentation from the city's records of missing documentation from the building inspector's files. Tab 6 is a submission, a 13-month submission of overtime by building inspector / detective for a period of November 2010 through December 29th, 2011. Tab 7 is a summary of undocumented work hours. It's prepared by the clerk with supporting documentation from the city records. Tab 8 is a invoice for legal fees submitted to the city of Villa Hills. So I move for the introduction of these exhibits.
Any objection?
No objection.
I'm gonna go on and introduce those, and we'll mark them as exhibits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so that we're clear, should
Instead of
anyone.
tab, yeah, sorry.
Instead of tab, and instead of collectively, so that they will be marked as exhibits 1 through 8, as noted. Any objection to that?
No, and then separate exhibit 1A, 1B, 1C.
Yes.
There's-
As noted in the tabs, but we're gonna call them exhibits, so that that's clear through.
I have no further questions for this witness.
Does anyone need to take a short break before we begin cross-examination, or shall we plow forward? We're going to take a 10-minute recess